What happens when two Hollywood legends collide in the most explosive live television confrontation ever captured? When Harrison Ford and Mel Gibson found themselves on the same couch at The View, nobody expected the verbal warfare that was about to unfold. This is the story of how one of cinema's most beloved heroes completely dismantled one of its most controversial figures live on national television. Make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about what went down that day. The tension was palpable from the moment Mel Gibson walked onto the View set. The studio audience gave him a lukewarm reception, a stark contrast to the thunderous applause that had greeted Harrison Ford just minutes earlier. Ford, promoting his latest film, had been charming the host with his trademark wit and self-deprecating humor. But as Gibson settled into his chair, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Host Whoopi Goldberg attempted to lighten the mood with some casual banter, but Gibson seemed agitated from the start. He fidgeted with his jacket, avoided eye contact with Ford, and gave curt responses to the opening questions about his upcoming project. Ford, meanwhile, maintained his composure, but his jaw was noticeably tightened, his eyes never leaving Gibson's face. "So, Mel, you're here to talk about your new film," Whoopi began. "But I have to ask, given some of the controversies in your past, how do you feel about sharing the stage with Harrison today?" Gibson's response was immediate and cutting. "Well, Whoopi, I think we should focus on the work, not on whatever agenda people might have. I've been making movies longer than most people here have been alive, and I don't need anyone's approval to continue doing what I do best." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Ford's eyebrows raised slightly, but he remained silent, letting Gibson dig his own grave. Joy Behar jumped in next, asking about Gibson's recent comments in a magazine interview where he had criticized what he called Hollywood's liberal elite. "I stand by everything I said," Gibson replied, his voice growing louder. "This industry has been taken over by people who hate traditional values, who want to destroy everything that made America great. And frankly, I'm tired of pretending otherwise just to keep some people comfortable." That's when Ford finally spoke up. His voice was calm, measured, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Mel, with all due respect, I think you might be confusing having different political opinions with hating America. I've been in this business for over 40 years, and I've worked with people from every background, every belief system. The idea that there's some conspiracy against traditional values is, well, it's just not reality." Gibson turned to face Ford directly, his eyes flashing with anger. "Easy for you to say, Harrison. You've never had to deal with real persecution. You've never had your career almost destroyed because you told the truth about what you believe. Some of us have paid a real price for speaking out." The hosts exchanged glances, sensing that this was escalating beyond typical celebrity banter. Sarah Haynes tried to redirect the conversation, asking about their respective upcoming projects, but Gibson wasn't finished. "You know what the real problem is," Gibson continued, pointing his finger at Ford. "People like you, who pretend to be above it all, who act like you're some kind of moral authority. You've made a career playing heroes, but when it comes to real courage to actually standing up for something that matters, you hide behind your publicist and your carefully crafted image." Ford's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Mel, I think there's a difference between courage and cruelty, and I think most people can tell the difference, even if you can't." The studio audience gasped audibly. Gibson's face turned red, and he leaned forward in his chair. "Are you calling me cruel, Harrison? Are you really going to sit there and lecture me about morality?" "I'm not lecturing anyone," Ford replied, his voice still calm, but now with an edge that made everyone in the studio pay attention. "I'm just pointing out that there's a difference between having strong convictions and using those convictions as an excuse to hurt people, and I think your record speaks for itself on that front." Gibson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. My record. Let me tell you about my record. I've made films that actually mean something, that actually have something to say about the human condition. I've taken risks. I've told stories that other people were afraid to tell. What have you done? You've played the same character for 30 years, flying spaceships and cracking whips. Don't talk to me about having something to say. The insult hit its mark, but Ford didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he was about to deliver a knockout punch. "You're right, Mel. I have played heroes. Characters that people look up to, that inspire them to be better. But here's the thing about heroes. They don't tear other people down to build themselves up. They don't use their platform to spread hate. They don't blame everyone else for their problems." Gibson's hands were shaking now. Whether from anger or something else, it was hard to tell. "You sanctimonious piece of," he began before catching himself and glancing at the cameras. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You live in your little bubble surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear. You've never faced real adversity. Never had to fight for anything." "Fighting for something and fighting against people are two different things," Ford replied. "And I think that's something you never learned." The tension in the studio was electric. The hosts had essentially become spectators to this battle between two Hollywood titans, and it was clear that this was far from over. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to regain control of the situation, her voice cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should take a step back here. We're live on national television, and I think our viewers would appreciate a more constructive conversation." But Gibson wasn't backing down. He remained standing, his face flushed with anger. "No, Whoopi. I think it's time people heard the truth. I'm sick of tiptoeing around people's feelings. Harrison wants to talk about heroes. Let's talk about real heroes. Let's talk about people who actually sacrifice something for their beliefs instead of just playing dress-up for the cameras." Ford leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening, Mel. Please tell us about these real heroes, people who serve their country in the military." Gibson shot back. "People who build businesses, who create jobs, who actually contribute to society instead of just pretending to be someone else for a living. But I guess that's too real for Hollywood's golden boy." The comment about military service was a calculated blow. Ford had never served in the military, something that had been a point of criticism from certain quarters throughout his career. But instead of getting defensive, Ford nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right about military service," Ford said quietly. "I have tremendous respect for people who serve. My father served in World War II, and I've always been humbled by that sacrifice. But you know what else I respect? People who use their platform responsibly, who understand that with great reach comes great responsibility." Gibson scoffed. "Responsibility? You mean the responsibility to conform to whatever the liberal media wants you to say? The responsibility to never question the narrative? Never speak truth to power?" "No," Ford replied, his voice growing stronger. "The responsibility to think before you speak. The responsibility to consider how your words affect other people. The responsibility to use your influence to build things up rather than tear them down." Joy Behar jumped in, trying to redirect the conversation. "Mel, you mentioned your new film. Can you tell us about the message you're trying to convey with this project?" Gibson's eyes lit up with evangelical fervor. "It's about redemption, Joy. It's about a man who loses everything because he refuses to compromise his principles, who faces persecution from the very people who should support him. It's about standing up for what's right even when everyone else tells you you're wrong." "That sounds like a very personal story," Sarah Haynes observed. "It is personal," Gibson replied, his voice rising again. "Because I've lived it. I've been blacklisted. I've been cancelled. I've had my career destroyed by people who couldn't handle the truth. But I survived it. And I'm stronger for it." Ford couldn't help himself. "Mel, with all due respect, you weren't cancelled. You faced consequences for your actions. There's a difference." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Gibson slowly turned to face forward, his expression dark. "Consequences for my actions. What actions? Harrison. Speaking my mind, expressing my beliefs. Or are you talking about something else?" Ford met his gaze steadily. "I'm talking about the drunk driving incident. I'm talking about the things you said to that police officer. I'm talking about the recorded phone conversations that came out later. Those weren't expressions of belief, Mel. Those were expressions of hate." Gibson's face went white, then red. "You don't know what you're talking about. You weren't there. You don't know what I was going through at that time in my life." "You're right. I wasn't there," Ford acknowledged. "But the whole world heard those recordings. The whole world saw what you said and the whole world drew their own conclusions." "I was drunk," Gibson said, his voice becoming defensive. "I was in a dark place. I said things I didn't mean." "Did you though?" Ford asked quietly. "Because when people are drunk, they usually say what they really think. They just lose the filter that normally stops them." The hosts exchanged worried glances. This was getting into dangerous territory, but both men seemed determined to see it through. Gibson stepped closer to Ford's chair. "You want to judge me? Fine. But let's talk about your mistakes, Harrison. Let's talk about the affairs, the divorces, the times you've let people down. At least I owned up to my problems instead of hiding behind a carefully managed image. Ford stood up slowly, his full height imposing even next to Gibson. You're right, Mel. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes in my personal life and I've hurt people I care about. But here's the difference between us. When I hurt someone, it was usually someone I loved. When you hurt someone, it was usually someone you didn't even know. That's not true, Gibson protested. Isn't it? Ford pressed. The police officer who was just doing his job. The reporters who were just asking questions. The entire Jewish community that you decided to blame for your problems. Those weren't people you knew personally. Mel, those were people you chose to hurt because you were angry at the world. Gibson's hands clenched into fists. You don't understand. You've never been under that kind of pressure. You've never had your entire world collapse around you. Actually, I have, Ford replied calmly. I've been through divorce. I've dealt with depression. I've struggled with alcohol. But I never used those struggles as an excuse to hurt innocent people. I never blamed an entire race of people for my problems. I never said that, Gibson shot back. But his voice lacked conviction. Ford pulled out his phone. And for a moment, Gibson looked panicked. Should I play the recording, Mel? Should I remind everyone exactly what you said that night? Put that away, Gibson demanded, his voice shaking. Why? Ford asked, his thumb hovering over the screen. These are your words, your beliefs. If you're so proud of speaking truth to power, why are you afraid to hear them again? The studio was dead quiet. The hosts looked like they wanted to crawl under their desks. Gibson's breathing was audible through his microphone. That's not who I am, Gibson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Then who are you, Mel? Ford asked, still holding the phone. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're exactly who you were that night. You're just better at hiding it now. Gibson stood frozen, staring at Ford's phone like it was a loaded weapon. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Whoopi finally found her voice. Harrison, I don't think that's necessary, she said carefully. But Ford wasn't listening to her. His eyes were locked on Gibson's face, watching every micro-expression. You know what, Mel? Ford said slowly, putting his phone away. I don't need to play that recording. Everyone already knows what you said, but what they might not know is what you did afterward. Gibson's relief at seeing the phone disappear was short-lived. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the apology tour, Ford continued, settling back into his chair like a predator getting comfortable. The carefully scripted interviews, the meetings with Jewish leaders, the donations to charity, all of it designed to rehabilitate your image. Not because you actually changed, but because you needed to work again. That's not true, Gibson protested, but his voice cracked slightly. Isn't it? Ford pressed. Because I was there, Mel. I was at some of those industry events where you were trying to make your comeback. I watched you work the room, shaking hands, making small talk, pretending to be the reformed man. But you know what I never saw? I never saw genuine remorse. I never saw someone who actually understood the pain they had caused. Joy Behar leaned forward. Harrison, what exactly did you witness? Ford's expression grew thoughtful. There was this one event, a charity dinner for Holocaust survivors. Mel was there making a big show of his support, writing a check for the cameras. But afterward in the parking lot, I heard him talking to someone on his phone. He was complaining about having to attend these things, about how it was all just a game he had to play to get back in Hollywood's good graces. Gibson's face went pale. That's not what happened. No, Ford asked, raising an eyebrow. Then please enlighten us. Tell us about your genuine transformation. Tell us about the moment you realized the error of your ways. Gibson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around the studio desperately, as if searching for an escape route. I'll tell you what I think happened, Ford continued, his voice growing more confident. I think you realized that your career was more important to you than your principles. I think you realized that you could either change your behavior or lose everything you'd worked for. So, you chose to change your behavior, not your heart. You don't know what's in my heart, Gibson said weakly. You're right. I don't, Ford acknowledged. But I know what comes out of your mouth. And even today, sitting here, you're still blaming everyone else for your problems. You're still positioning yourself as the victim. You're still refusing to take real responsibility for the harm you've caused. Sarah Haynes tried to interject. Maybe we should move on to something else. But Ford wasn't finished. No, Sarah. I think this is important because this isn't just about Mel. This is about accountability. This is about the difference between saying you're sorry and actually being sorry. Gibson finally found his voice again. I have apologized. I've apologized publicly, privately. I've made amends. Have you? Ford asked. Or have you just done what your publicist told you to do? Because there's a difference between going through the motions and actually changing who you are. I have changed, Gibson insisted. Ford pulled out his phone again, but this time he didn't threaten to play a recording. Instead, he began reading from the screen. This is from an interview you gave just 6 months ago. Quote, I've learned to be more careful about what I say in public, but I haven't changed my core beliefs. I still think this industry has problems, and I still think someone needs to speak out about them. End quote. Gibson's shoulders sagged. That's taken out of context. Is it? Ford asked. Because it sounds to me like you're saying you've learned to hide your true feelings better, not that you've actually changed them. The studio audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the camera operators seemed mesmerized by the verbal destruction taking place before them. Let me ask you something, Mel. Ford continued. Do you actually believe that Jewish people control Hollywood? Do you believe that they are responsible for your career problems? Gibson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I don't. It's a simple question, Ford pressed. Yes or no? Do you believe that Jewish people are responsible for the problems in your life? No, Gibson finally said, but his voice was barely audible. I'm sorry I couldn't hear you, Ford said, cupping his ear theatrically. Could you repeat that a little louder? No, Gibson said again, slightly louder this time. Good, Ford said, nodding. Now, do you believe that your drunk driving incident and subsequent comments were your fault and your fault alone? Gibson hesitated again. Yes. And do you believe that the consequences you faced were appropriate given the severity of your actions? Another pause. Yes. Excellent, Ford said, clapping his hands together. Now we're getting somewhere. So if all of that is true, why did you spend the first 20 minutes of this interview blaming everyone else for your problems? Gibson stared at him, trapped by his own admissions. I don't know. I do, Ford said quietly. It's because you haven't actually changed, Mel. You've just learned to say the right words when you're backed into a corner. But your instinct is still to blame others, to position yourself as the victim, to avoid taking real responsibility. Whoopi tried one more time to redirect. Gentlemen, perhaps we should discuss your upcoming projects. But Ford was relentless. Actually, Whoopi, I think Mel's upcoming project is very relevant to this conversation. Tell us about it, Mel. Tell us about this movie where you play a man who's persecuted for his beliefs. Gibson looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. It's just a movie, Harrison. Is it? Ford asked. Or is it your way of rewriting history? Your way of casting yourself as the hero instead of the villain? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still trying to convince the world that you're the victim in all of this. That's not what the movie is about, Gibson protested. Then what is it about? Ford challenged. Because you described it earlier as being about a man who loses everything because he refuses to compromise his principles. That sounds an awful lot like how you see yourself. Gibson's voice was barely a whisper now. It's about redemption. Whose redemption? Ford asked. Because real redemption requires real accountability. It requires actually understanding the harm you've caused and working to make amends. It requires changing not just your behavior, but your heart. And I haven't seen any evidence that you've done any of that. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Gibson stood there completely defeated, unable to form a coherent response. You know what the really tragic thing is, Mel? Ford said, his voice softening slightly. You're actually a talented filmmaker. You've made some genuinely powerful movies. You could have used your platform to do real good in the world, but instead you chose to use it to spread hate and division. And even now, even after everything that's happened, you're still making that same choice. Gibson's eyes filled with tears. Whether from anger, shame, or frustration, it was impossible to tell. I don't know what you want from me, Harrison. I want you to tell the truth, Ford said simply. I want you to stop playing the victim and start taking real responsibility. I want you to use your platform to heal instead of hurt. But most importantly, I want you to do it because it's the right thing to do, not because it's good for your career. Gibson looked around the studio one more time, at the hosts, at the cameras, at the audience. Then he looked back at Ford and for just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been genuine remorse. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, and I'm sorry for continuing to make excuses. You're right. I haven't really changed. I've just gotten better at hiding who I am. Ford nodded slowly. That's a start, Mel. But saying it here on television isn't enough. You need to prove it with your actions. You need to show the world that you're capable of real change. Gibson wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders. You're right. I will. I hope so, Ford said. Because the world needs more people who build bridges, not walls. It needs more people who use their influence to bring out the best in humanity, not the worst. As the show went to commercial break, Gibson quietly walked off the set, his head hanging low. Ford remained seated, watching him go, his expression unreadable. The confrontation was over, but the impact would be felt for years to come. Ford had done something that few people in Hollywood had been willing to do. He had held a mirror up to Gibson's face and forced him to see the truth about himself. What did you think about Ford's takedown of Gibson? Was he too harsh, or was this exactly what needed to happen? Let me know in the comments below.